Ranger!
A former Navy SEAL thought the flood
Grab
had
my
taken
hand.
his German Shepherd forever. For years, Ethan Cole lived with one old collar by the door and one wound he never spoke about. Then another storm came without warning, and the creek behind his cabin rose like the past returning. He slipped into the raging water, broke his leg against hidden stone, and held on through the night.
Help!
At dawn, when his strength was almost
Somebody
gone,
help me! I
a
can't
familiar
hold
bark
on much
tore
longer!
through the rain. The dog he believed was dead had finally found the way home, not to be saved, but to save him. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from. Leave your feelings below, and please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers. Ethan Cole had learned, long before he came home, that silence could have weight. Some silences were light, like snow resting on pine branches before dawn. Others sat on a man's chest and waited for him to stop fighting. After 2 tours, after medals he kept in a drawer, and nightmares he never named out loud, Ethan knew the second kind too well. He was 34 then, standing 6 feet tall with the compact, hardened build of a man shaped by endurance rather than vanity. Nothing about him looked polished. His strength did not belong to mirrors or gym lights. It belonged to cold mornings, heavy packs, bad terrain, and the old discipline of doing what had to be done even when no one clapped afterward. And his face was clean-shaven, showing a square jaw and high cheekbones that made him appear sterner than he meant to be. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, just a little longer than regulation, as though some quiet part of him had begun negotiating with civilian life. Northern wind had roughened his light skin into a weathered tan, and his gray-blue eyes carried the calm of deep water, beautiful, if one did not look long enough to see what had sunk beneath it. He lived near Briar Creek then, in a valley where the mountains stood like old judges, and the weather changed its mind without apology. The town below knew him as polite, useful, and impossible to know. Ethan fixed fences for widows, carried feed bags for old farmers, and helped pull a truck from mud once without accepting payment. He could be kind with his hands, but not with his words. Words had begun to feel too breakable. Only Ranger seemed to understand that. Ranger was a 5-year-old male German shepherd, black and gold, broad through the shoulders and deep in the chest, with the lean power of a working-line dog. His muzzle was dark, his ears stood sharp, and his amber-brown eyes watched the world with an intelligence that often made strangers lower their voices. There was an old brown leather collar around his neck, plain and worn soft at the edges. He was not a playful dog in the foolish sense, though he had his comedy. He stole Ethan's socks only when Ethan was taking life too seriously, and he had once carried a dead pine cone into the kitchen with the dignity of a knight presenting a royal crown. But beneath that small mischief was training. Ethan had trained Ranger for search work in rough terrain, for following a weak voice through storm and brush, for gripping fabric without tearing flesh, for pulling a person by a sleeve, collar, or harness when panic made limbs useless. Ranger could find a lost child in wet leaves. He could hold still beside the injured. He could lead rescuers back to what he had found. Ethan had never called him a pet. The word felt too small, like calling a lighthouse a candle. Ranger was his witness. On the worst nights, when Ethan woke with his hands clenched and his breath trapped somewhere between memory and shame, Ranger would rise from the floor without a sound. The dog would cross the dark room, press his head against Ethan's knee, and wait. Not demand. Not whine. Just wait. with the patience of a creature who knew that grief, like bad weather, could not be ordered away. Those were the nights Ethan survived without admitting he had needed help. The valley had been wet for 3 days before the flood came. Rain had softened the roads, swollen the ditches, and turned the creek from a silver ribbon into a brown mussel twisting through the trees. By evening, the clouds had dropped so low that the mountains seemed to be wearing them around their shoulders like mourning cloth. Ethan noticed the water first, while checking the small wooden bridge north of town. It crossed a narrow gorge where Briar Creek usually hurried over stones and roots. That night, the creek no longer hurried. It charged. Ranger stood beside him in the rain, ears forward, body still. Water roared below with a sound too big for the valley. "Not good," Ethan muttered. Ranger looked at him, then toward the far side of the bridge. Headlights flickered beyond the trees. A battered blue pickup sat crooked near the far bank, one tire sunk in mud, its hazard lights blinking weakly through sheets of rain. Beside it, 3 figures huddled under the useless shelter of a broken roadside pine. Ethan moved before thought finished forming. The family was the Bellows. Ethan knew them in the loose way small towns made neighbors of everyone. Martin Bellow, 42, was a tired, heavy-shouldered mechanic, with oil always beneath his nails and a habit of apologizing even when he had done nothing wrong. His wife, Claire, was 38, thin and pale from years of worry more than illness, with auburn hair plastered to her cheeks by rain and the fierce eyes of a mother who would bargain with God using both fists. Their son, Noah, was 7, small for his age, all knees and fear, clutching a red backpack to his chest, as if school books might keep the world from breaking. "The road washed out," Martin shouted when Ethan reached them. "We tried to turn around." Behind them, water had begun cutting across the low ground. Not a puddle, not runoff, on a moving sheet, fast and rising. Ethan looked at the bridge. Old timber, iron bolts, too much water below. The safe answer was to wait. The human answer was that the bank behind the family was already crumbling. "Across now," Ethan said. Claire shook her head. "The bridge, now." There was no sharpness in his voice, only command, the kind that reached scared people before reason did. Ranger went first, low and steady, paws striking wet planks. Ethan guided Noah behind him, one hand gripping the boy's coat, the other holding the rope he had pulled from his truck. Martin followed with Claire, both moving too fast until Ethan barked, "Slow, one step at a time." Halfway across, the bridge groaned. Noah whimpered. Ranger stopped and looked back. And that was the thing about Ranger. He did not panic when people did. His body lowered, braced. Rain streamed from his coat. Gold and black turned almost silver under the storm. He edged back to Noah and pressed his shoulder against the child's legs, steadying him. "Good boy," Ethan whispered, though the words vanished in the thunder. They were nearly across when the hillside above the gorge gave way. Mud, stones, and broken branches slammed into the creek upstream. The water rose like something alive. A black wave struck the old bridge from beneath. The first plank snapped. Martin stumbled. Claire screamed. Noah slipped from Ethan's grip and slid toward the broken edge. Ranger lunged, and the dog caught Noah by the back of his jacket. Not skin, not arm, exactly as he had been trained, and dragged him sideways, away from the opening. Ethan seized the boy under one arm and shoved him toward Martin. "Run!" Martin took Noah. Claire reached for Ethan, but another impact shook the bridge so violently that her hand missed his by inches. Then Ranger did something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. The dog turned back toward him instead of running to safety, as if loyalty had overruled every natural law that told a living creature to save itself. "Ranger, go!" Ethan shouted. Ranger did not go. The center beam cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, when for one suspended second, Ethan saw everything too clearly. Claire crawling to the far bank, Martin clutching Noah, Ranger's amber eyes fixed on him, rain jumping from the bridge in white sparks, the creek opening its black mouth below. Then the bridge broke. Ethan fell through wood and water and noise. Cold hit him so hard it stole the shape of his thoughts. The current took him under, rolled him, slammed his shoulder into something solid. He fought upward, broke the surface, swallowed rain and creek water together. He heard someone scream his name, or maybe he imagined it. "Ranger!" He saw the dog once, only once. A flash of black and gold in the flood, front paws striking at the water, ears flattened, mouth open as if barking, though no sound could rise above the roar. Ethan reached for him. His fingers closed on nothing but rain. A log hit Ethan in the ribs. The world turned. The creek carried him like it had never known his name. He struck rocks, vanished under foam, surfaced beneath branches. Training kept him alive after hope fell behind. He twisted feet first, protected his head when he could, grabbed at anything that passed. At last his arm hooked over the fork of a fallen cottonwood, jammed against the bank. Pain tore through his shoulder as the current tried to keep him, but the tree held. Ethan dragged himself half out of the water and collapsed across the mud. For a long time there was only rain. When dawn came, it came gray and ashamed. The rescuers found him shivering beside the fallen tree, lips blue, one eye swollen, ribs bruised purple beneath his soaked combat shirt. Hank Mercer was among them even then. A broad, weathered man in his early 60s with a gray beard, a rescue jacket, and the practical sadness of someone who had seen rivers win too many arguments. Hank wrapped a blanket around Ethan and kept saying, "Easy now, son, easy." But Ethan would not be easy. "Ranger," he rasped. "Find Ranger." They searched all morning, then all afternoon. Men walked the banks with poles. Volunteers checked debris piles. Hank went farther downstream than anyone expected for a dog. Martin Bellow, face broken with guilt, joined despite a bleeding cut over his brow. Claire stayed with Noah at the clinic, where the boy would not let go of the torn piece of jacket Ranger had bitten to save him. They found Ethan's flashlight. They found 2 broken planks from the bridge. Near dusk, Hank found the old brown leather collar snagged around a branch half buried in mud. No body, no tracks, no answering bark. Ethan took the collar in both hands. Mud covered the buckle. One strip of leather had torn almost clean through. He stared at it with the strange stillness of a man watching the last window in a house go dark. People tried to comfort him because people are generous and helpless in the face of certain kinds of loss. "He saved that boy," Martin whispered. Ethan said nothing. "He was a hero," Hank added gently. "That was meant to help. It did not. And because hero was a word people gave the dead, so the living could survive the debt." Ethan looked toward the creek, still swollen and brown under the bruised evening sky, and felt something in him close with the finality of a locked door. Ranger had followed him into the storm. Ranger had turned back. Ranger had vanished. From that day on, Ethan would carry the truth as he understood it. The river had taken his dog, but it had left the guilt behind. And guilt, unlike a body, did not need to be found in order to haunt a man. Years made a man quieter if he let them. Ethan Cole let them. By the time the valley stopped speaking of the flood in lowered voices, Ethan had already moved farther north, beyond the last gravel road, where mailboxes leaned like old men, and the pines grew thick enough to make noon feel private. He bought a small cabin beside Briar Creek, with money he had never learned how to enjoy, and he told anyone who asked that he liked the solitude. That was not entirely a lie. Solitude did not ask him if he was all right. It did not tell him Ranger had died a hero. It did not touch his shoulder in the grocery store and soften its voice until pity became another weather system pressing against his skin. Solitude simply sat with him. Some mornings that made it kinder than people. The cabin was built from dark pine logs weathered almost black by long winters. Its roof sloped low against snow, and its front porch faced a narrow clearing where deer sometimes stepped through the fog with the grace of creatures who had never owed anyone an explanation. Behind the cabin, Briar Creek moved over stone and root, silver in summer, black-green in autumn, and pale as old bone when ice held the edges. On gentle days, the creek sounded harmless. It murmured beside the cabin like an old woman telling secrets to herself. But Ethan knew better. Water was never harmless. It only waited for enough weight from the sky. He lived by a strict pattern: dawn coffee, wood stove, perimeter walk, check the culvert behind the shed, check the generator, clear branches from the drainage ditch, split firewood, repair whatever the forest had damaged overnight, eat because the body demanded it, sleep because eventually even memory had to close its eyes. At 38, Ethan still carried the compact power of his old life. His shoulders were lean and controlled under his old olive tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened by years of use, frayed faintly at the cuffs and shoulders, faded by weather and washing until it looked almost part of the woods. His moss-green combat pants were worn at the knees, cargo pockets sagging slightly from years of tools, rope, and habit. Old military work boots held his steps steady, and a battered military watch sat on his wrist, as if time itself were something he still had to monitor. And his face remained clean-shaven, his square jaw and high cheekbones giving him a severity that strangers mistook for coldness. His dark brown hair, cut short in a military style, had grown only a little beyond old regulations. The northern wind had darkened his fair skin, and his gray-blue eyes had become quieter, not softer. Quieter was not the same thing. Near the front door, hanging from a wooden peg, was Ranger's old brown leather collar. Ethan never touched it unless he had to dust around it. Even then, his fingers moved carefully, like the thing might still feel pain. The torn edge had stiffened over the years. The buckle had been cleaned, though mud still hid in one crease where no brush could quite reach. Visitors sometimes looked at it and said nothing. That was wise. Ethan had not brought another dog into the cabin. Men in town occasionally offered pups from good lines, working dogs, loyal dogs, strong dogs. He always said no before they finished speaking. It was not cruelty. It was not even fear. Some names filled a house so completely there was no room for another bark. The only person who ignored Ethan's careful distance was Hank Mercer. Hank lived about a mile through the trees in a squat little house with a rusted tin roof and 3 wood piles arranged with military seriousness, though he had never served. He was in his mid-60s, broad through the chest, and slightly bent from a lifetime of hauling timber, fence posts, rescue ropes, and other people's bad decisions. And his hair was short and gray, his beard trimmed close to a weathered jaw. and his hands looked as if they had been carved from rootwood. Hank's eyes were pale brown and sharp, but not unkind. He had once worked as a logger, then as a volunteer rescue man, and grief had visited him often enough that he no longer tried to defeat it with speeches. He arrived every other week, whether invited or not. "You alive?" he would call from the porch. "Unfortunately," Ethan usually answered. Hank liked that joke more than it deserved. One cold afternoon in late October, Hank came up the path carrying a sack of venison stew jars from Mrs. Klein in town. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant rain. Ethan was behind the shed, cleaning pine needles from the metal grate over the drainage channel. Hank watched him work for a while before speaking. "You know, most folks use a rake." Ethan pulled a clump of mud and needles free by hand. "Most folks enjoy doing things twice." "Fair point." Hank set the sack on a stump and looked toward the creek. It was low that day, slipping around rocks with innocent brightness. Fallen leaves moved along the surface like little burnt orange boats. A pretty thing, if a man did not know how quickly pretty things could grow teeth. "You keeping that generator serviced?" Hank asked. "Yes." "Pump under the crawl space?" "Yes." "Culvert?" Ethan lifted the mud in his hand. Hank grunted. All right. No need to flirt." Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. That was Hank's peculiar gift, and he could toss a joke onto a dark floor without expecting it to light the whole room, just enough to keep a man from tripping over himself. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Hank cleared a small branch from the ditch with his boot, then leaned on the handle of his walking stick. "Seen something odd lately," he said. Ethan did not look up. Around here, odd narrows it down poorly. "Dog." The word entered the air and changed its temperature. Ethan's hand stilled in the drainage grate. Hank either did not notice or kindly pretended not to. "Big shepherd. German, I'd say. Black and gold. Older dog, maybe. Came around my porch 3 times this month." Ethan resumed working, too slowly. "Could be someone's loose dog from town," he said. "Oh, could be." Hank scratched his beard. "But he moves like he knows the woods. Doesn't come close when I'm outside. Eats what I leave after I go back in." Smart animal. Ethan pulled another clump of leaves loose and tossed it aside. His voice came out flat. "Coyotes will take him if he keeps wandering." "Maybe." Hank studied him. "Maybe not." The creek clicked over stones. Somewhere deeper in the pines, a raven gave a rough laugh, as if the forest had heard a private joke. Ethan stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and reached for the tool bucket. "You want coffee?" Hank let the subject drop because he was old enough to know when a door had closed. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, coffee grounds, oiled tools, and loneliness kept too clean. Hank sat at the small kitchen table while Ethan poured coffee into chipped enamel mugs. The room was orderly in a way that suggested not peace, but control. A rifle cleaned and locked above the cabinet. Boots aligned by the door. Firewood stacked by length. Canned goods labeled by month. A folded wool blanket on the chair Ethan never used. Hank's eyes moved once to the collar by the door. Ethan saw it. Neither man spoke of it. Then, just as Hank lifted his mug, something scraped softly against the outside wall near the porch. One slow drag, a pause, then another. And both men stopped breathing, as if the cabin itself had whispered a name neither of them was brave enough to say. Hank turned toward the door. Ethan did not move. The sound came again. Not a knock. not the wind. A careful brushing along the boards, low to the ground. Hank set his mug down. "You expecting anything?" "No." Ethan crossed the room with the controlled quiet of old training. He opened the door. The porch was empty. Cold air entered, smelling of pine, damp soil, and the metallic promise of rain. Beyond the steps, the clearing lay gray under the afternoon. Nothing moved except tall grass bowing under wind. Then Ethan saw it. Near the bottom step, pressed into the damp earth, was a single paw print, large, clean-edged, too large for a fox, too narrow for a bear cub, a dog's print. Hank came up behind him, careful not to crowd. "Well," the old man said softly, "that's no coyote." Ethan stared at the print until his eyes began to hurt. Some part of him wanted to step down, kneel, measure it with his palm, follow it into the trees like a fool chasing a ghost. Another part, the harder, meaner survivor inside him, dragged the door shut before hope could get its fingers around his throat. "Stray," he said. Hank did not argue. He only looked at Ethan with a sadness that had learned manners. After Hank left, Ethan remained by the window longer than necessary. The clearing darkened. The trees gathered shadow under their branches. Once he thought he saw movement near the far pines, a low shape slipping between trunks. But by the time he focused, there was only forest. That night, he did not sleep well. Rain began after midnight, soft at first. It tapped the roof gently, almost politely, as if asking permission, and Ethan lay awake and listened. The creek behind the cabin thickened in sound. Not dangerous yet, just fuller, restless. By morning, the valley had turned the color of pewter. Ethan walked the property before breakfast. He checked the shed. The generator started on the second pull, rough for a moment, then steady. The drainage channel was clear. The culvert mouth was open. He stood by the creek with his hood up, watching brown water curl around the stones. The paw print near the porch had blurred in the rain. Its edges softened until it could have belonged to anything. That irritated him more than it should have. He told himself it was because he liked evidence. A clean print had use. A blurred print was only mud with ambition. Near noon, Hank called on the radio to warn him that weather reports had shifted. Nothing dramatic. More rain than expected. Maybe gusting wind. Maybe runoff from the upper ridges. "Nothing you can't handle?" Hank said. "That your official forecast?" "That's my old man forecast. Different science." Ethan looked toward the creek. "I'll keep an eye on it." "Do that." The radio clicked off. By late afternoon, the air had grown heavy enough to press against the windows. The pines behind the cabin swayed in the wrong direction, their tops bending against wind that seemed to come down from the ridges rather than across the valley. Ethan stacked extra wood by the stove, checked his flashlight batteries, and filled 2 metal water cans out of habit. He told himself he was being practical, but before dusk, he went back to the front door and looked once more at the place where the paw print had been. Rain had erased it completely. For a long moment, Ethan stood with one hand on the doorframe and the other near the old collar hanging beside him. He did not touch it. He had not earned that. Some bitter place inside him said. Outside, Briar Creek lifted its voice, not roaring yet, not threatening, only speaking louder than it had that morning, rushing over stones with a hard, impatient sound. The forest darkened early. Clouds lowered over the treetops until the whole valley seemed to crouch beneath them. Ethan closed the door, locked it, and fed another piece of wood into the stove. Behind the cabin, unseen in the growing dark, the creek kept rising. By dusk, the rain had stopped pretending to be weather. It became a siege. It struck the cabin roof in hard, slanting waves and ran down the windows in trembling sheets. The pines behind the house bent and straightened, like old men trying not to kneel. Beyond them, the mountains had vanished behind a wall of gray-black cloud, and Briar Creek, which only that morning had moved with a steady, cold patience, now spoke in a lower, angrier voice. Ethan Cole stood at the kitchen window with one hand resting on the edge of the sink. He had not turned on many lights. He never did. The cabin needed only what was useful. One lamp near the stove, one over the counter, one small bulb above the front door. Anything more felt like asking the darkness for permission to exist. And outside, the creek rose inch by inch. Ethan watched the water with the stillness of a man who had learned long ago that fear wasted oxygen. But stillness was not peace. His mind was already measuring distance, angle, slope, flow. He knew where the ground dipped behind the shed. He knew where the culvert ran beneath the gravel path. He knew how fast runoff could gather in the high ridges when rain fell hard where no one was watching. The forecast had called for scattered rain. That almost made him laugh. Forecasts were promises made by people who did not live beside water. The radio on the shelf crackled, spat static, then gave half a sentence about heavy precipitation north of the valley. The voice disappeared before finishing the warning. Ethan adjusted the dial with 2 fingers, a more static, a broken fragment. Then nothing but a hiss like wind through dead grass. His phone showed 1 weak bar, then none. Perfect, he muttered. The word sounded too loud in the cabin. He crossed to the back door and opened it. Cold rain pushed inside at once, needling his face and dampening the floorboards. The smell of the creek came with it. Mud, torn roots, stone, something metallic and old. Behind the cabin, the small shed hunched near the bank, its tin roof shining under flashes of lightning. Beside it, a shallow drainage channel carried water away from the foundation toward the creek. Usually, Ethan kept that channel clear enough to drink from if a man had bad judgment and a strong stomach. Now water was pooling where it should not. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he pulled on his rain jacket but did not go out yet. A careless man hurried. A trained man counted. He checked the basement hatch first. Beneath the cabin, the sump pump gave its usual low mechanical hum. The sound was ordinary, almost comforting. He checked the small storage room, sealed bins of food, extra blankets, medical supplies, fuel stabilizer, spare batteries, water filters. 2 cases of canned soup Hank had once mocked as end-of-days cuisine for men with no imagination. Everything was dry. For the moment. Ethan climbed back up and stood in the kitchen, listening. The pump hummed, rain hammered, the creek kept rising. Then the cabin went dark. Not dim, not flickering. Gone. The pump below died with a small, final click. And for 1 second, the silence after the electricity failed felt enormous. Then the storm rushed in to fill it. Ethan took the flashlight from the hook by the stove, then stopped. His eyes went to the old military watch on his wrist. 11:42 p.m. He could wait. That was his first thought, and it was not cowardice. Going outside in that weather was a stupid risk unless something forced the issue. The generator sat behind the shed under a small lean-to. He had checked it that morning. It would run. But crossing wet ground near a rising creek in the dark was not a chore. It was a negotiation with a thing that did not negotiate back. He went to the basement hatch again and opened it. Water had begun to bead along the far wall. Not much, less than a finger's width, but it was moving, and he crouched and aimed the flashlight beneath the floor joists. A thin line of water crawled inward from the low side of the foundation, slow but steady. Without the pump, it would keep coming. If it reached the electrical panel or ruined the heating system, the cabin would not simply be uncomfortable. It would become unlivable in cold weather. Ethan shut the hatch. "All right," he said softly. There was no drama in it, only decision. He moved through the cabin with efficient calm. Heavy rain jacket, gloves, headlamp, extra flashlight clipped to his belt, rope, folding saw, a short pry bar. He pulled his old military work boots tighter, checked the soles with one thumb, and stepped to the back door. Before he opened it, he looked once toward Ranger's old collar near the front entrance. Ranger's old collar near the front entrance. Not for comfort, not even for courage, just because some wounds had become part of his inventory. Then he went outside. The rain hit him hard enough to make him lower his head. Wind shoved at his shoulders. The yard behind the cabin had already turned slick, mud shining under the beam of his headlamp. Every step made a wet sucking sound. Ethan moved slowly. He kept one hand near the rope at his belt and the other balancing the flashlight. The shed was only 30 yards away, but distance changed in bad weather. 30 yards in sunlight was a stroll. 30 yards in rain, wind, mud, and rising water was a test with a temper. He reached the generator lean-to and knelt. The machine was cold, but dry enough. He checked the fuel valve, choke, oil cap, and cable line with practiced hands. On the second pull, the generator coughed, complained, then caught. Its engine settled into a rough, steady growl. A few lights blinked back on inside the cabin. Good. But when Ethan turned toward the drainage channel, the brief satisfaction left him. A log had jammed across the culvert mouth. Not a branch. A real log. Water dark and heavy, wedged at an angle where the channel narrowed before dropping toward the creek. Smaller debris had gathered behind it. Pine needles, sticks, mud, torn moss, forming an ugly little dam. Water spilled around it and backed toward the cabin foundation in a spreading sheet. That was the problem. And he could leave the generator running, but if the drainage stayed blocked, the pump would be fighting a losing battle. The creek was not just rising, it was pushing back. Ethan clipped his rope to the iron ring mounted on the shed wall, then tested the line with a hard pull. It held. He tied the other end around his waist with a quick rescue knot. Not perfect. Good enough for a short move near the bank. Then he started toward the culvert. The ground dipped there. He knew it did. He had walked it 100 times. But tonight, the slope was hidden under brown water and whipping rain. He planted his boots sideways for grip, lowered his center of gravity, and used the pry bar like a staff, close now, and the log shifted under the pressure of the water, then slammed back into place with a hollow knock. Ethan crouched at the culvert mouth. Cold water ran over his boots. He wedged the pry bar under the log and pushed. Nothing. He adjusted his position. Pushed again. The log moved half an inch. Behind him, the generator growled. In front of him, the creek roared beyond the drainage cut, louder than before. The sound was not behind the storm anymore. It was inside it. Then Ethan saw something that made his stomach tighten. The water near the culvert was not merely rising. It was swirling backward, as if the creek had found a hidden way under the bank and was hollowing the earth beneath his feet. He froze. That was bad. That was very bad, and he eased his weight back, preparing to retreat and reassess. But the log shifted again, grinding against stone. If it jammed deeper, the channel would choke completely. One more pull, he told himself. Clear the obstruction, then back away. He hooked the pry bar under the log, braced one boot against a buried rock, and pulled with his whole body. The log came loose. For half a second, water surged forward exactly as it should have, roaring through the freed channel toward the creek. Ethan felt the pressure change under his boots. Then the bank gave way. Not gradually, not with warning. The ground beneath his left foot vanished. Mud, grass, stone, and root dropped into darkness. Ethan's body pitched sideways. The rope snapped taut around his waist, yanking the breath from his lungs, and he slammed one knee into the edge of the collapsing bank and grabbed for anything solid. His gloved fingers closed on wet grass. It tore free. The iron ring on the shed wall groaned behind him. Ethan twisted, trying to get his right boot under him, trying to roll away from the collapse instead of into it. For one brutal instant, training and instinct almost saved him. Then the shed wall cracked. The old board holding the iron ring split under the strain. The ring tore loose with a sound like a pistol shot. The rope went slack. Ethan fell. He hit the water hard. Cold swallowed him whole. The creek was not deep enough to dive into and not shallow enough to stand in. It was the worst kind of water, fast, violent, full of hidden stone. The current seized him before he could find the bottom, and he struck something with his shoulder, spun, went under, surfaced only long enough to drag in half a breath of rain. His headlamp ripped away. Blackness jumped around him. He tried to angle toward the bank, but the current slammed him sideways. His right leg hit a submerged boulder with such force that white pain exploded through his body. Something broke. Ethan knew it immediately. Not a sprain, not a bruise. Bone. The pain was so complete it became almost soundless. His mouth opened, but the creek took whatever came out. He clawed at the water, one leg useless beneath him, the other kicking hard enough to send fire up his spine. The bank slid past in fragments. Roots, mud, stones, a flash of the shed light, then darkness again. He reached once and missed. Reached again. His hand struck a branch jutting from a half-fallen alder at the creek's edge. He grabbed it with both hands. The current tried to tear him loose. Ethan held. His body swung downstream, shoulder screaming, broken leg dragging in the violent water. He gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached. Inch by inch, he pulled himself toward the branch, toward the muddy shelf beneath it, toward anything that was not the open current. His chest hit a submerged root. He held there, gasping. Rain fell on his face. The creek hammered his lower body. His broken leg throbbed with every pulse of blood, and the bank above him was too steep, too slick, too far. The cabin lights glowed weakly through the storm behind him, close enough to see, too far to reach. Ethan wrapped both arms around the branch and locked his grip. He looked once toward the cabin, where the generator still ran and the pump had likely come back to life, doing exactly what he had gone out to make possible. A bitter, breathless laugh almost left him. Then another surge of water struck, and the laugh died. Ethan lowered his forehead against the wet bark and held on. Behind him, in the dark, Briar Creek kept rising. The cold did not arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a command. It seized Ethan Cole's chest first, clamping around his ribs so hard that breathing became a task instead of an instinct. Then it spread down his arms, into his hands, into the broken fire screaming through his right leg. The creek had him from the waist down, and it pulled with the patience of a thing that had all night. Ethan locked both arms around the branch and held on. The alder tree grew crooked from the bank, its roots half exposed where years of running water had chewed away the earth beneath it. One thick branch jutted low over the creek, slick with rain, trembling under the force of Ethan's weight, and his upper body was partly wedged against a muddy shelf and a tangle of roots, but his hips and legs were still in the current. Every surge lifted him, twisted him, tried to peel him loose. His broken leg dragged below him like it belonged to someone else. He tried not to look at it. Looking made pain more real, and pain was already doing a fine job introducing itself. He took inventory because inventory was better than fear. Right leg. Broken, maybe lower leg, maybe worse. Left shoulder, strained from the fall and the branch catch. Ribs, bruised, breathing painful but possible. Hands, functioning for now. Head, no obvious skull injury, though darkness and rain had begun to blur at the edges. No phone, no headlamp, no loose rope within reach. No way up the bank, and he tried to shift his weight onto the muddy shelf. The moment he moved, the current caught his lower body and slammed his broken leg against a submerged stone. White pain burst behind his eyes. His jaw opened, but the creek swallowed the sound before it could become a cry. He froze, shaking. "Easy," he whispered to himself. The word sounded ridiculous under the roar of the water. He said it again anyway. "Easy." Rain beat his back and neck. Water rushed past his waist with animal force. Above him, the bank rose only a few feet, but it might as well have been a cliff. The mud was loose. The roots were slick. His body had strength, yes, but strength was not magic. A man with a broken leg and half his weight in floodwater did not climb because he wanted to, and he climbed if physics allowed him. Tonight, physics had no manners. Ethan tightened his grip around the branch and tried to breathe through the pain. He thought of the cabin lights behind him, the generator still running, the sump pump probably working again beneath the floor. Some bitter little corner of his mind informed him that the mission had technically succeeded. That almost made him laugh. A Navy SEAL, decorated, trained, stubborn as an iron nail, had managed to save his canned soup from dampness while drowning behind his own cabin. If Ranger had been there, the dog would have stared at him with that solemn amber judgment, as if to say, "Excellent work, genius." The thought hit him harder than the cold. Ethan shut his eyes. No, not now. But grief had always been rude, and it came when the door was locked, when the room was dark, when a man was too tired to argue. The sound of the creek around him changed, not truly, but inside his skull. This was not Briar Creek behind his cabin anymore. It was the gorge from years ago. It was broken bridge timber. It was rain bouncing white off black water. It was his own voice tearing itself raw on one name. Ranger. He opened his eyes into darkness. The branch shuddered under his arms. "Stay here," he muttered, though he did not know whether he was speaking to himself, the branch, or the ghost of a dog. The storm pressed down harder. Minutes passed strangely. Some stretched long enough to hold a lifetime. Others disappeared completely. Lifetime. Others disappeared completely. Ethan tried counting breaths, then stopped at 47 when a surge of water hit him, and the number scattered. He tried counting heartbeats, but pain made them unreliable. He tried focusing on the house, but the faint glow through the storm came and went behind sheets of rain. He needed to get more of his weight onto the shelf. Slowly, with both arms locked around the branch, he drew his left knee upward. Mud sucked at his boot. The current fought him. His right leg dragged and flared with pain so bright it became almost holy, the kind of pain old saints might have mistaken for a message from heaven if heaven had a nasty sense of humor. His left boot found a root. Good. He pressed down. The root held for 1 second. Then it peeled from the mud. Ethan slid backward. His arms snapped tight around the branch. Bark tore through one glove. His chin hit wet wood, and the current swung his body downstream until his shoulder felt as if it might come apart. He snarled through clenched teeth and hauled himself back the few inches he had lost. When he stopped moving, he was breathing like a wounded animal. Not good. He knew the pattern. Cold stole strength quietly. It did not kick down the door. It picked the lock. First it took precision, then judgment, then will. A man could be alive and already negotiating with surrender. He flexed his fingers one at a time. Thumb, index, middle, ring, little, again. Thumb, index, middle, ring, little. Keep the hands working. Keep the brain awake. Keep the water from owning the story. And then, somewhere between pain and exhaustion, Ethan remembered a training field years earlier. Ranger crouched in wet grass, ears forward, waiting for one command. Ethan had whispered, "Find me," and the dog had crossed 200 yards of rain and darkness as if love itself had a scent. The memory did not comfort him. It broke him open. Because Ethan had never given that command, the night ranger vanished. He had shouted the dog's name. He had screamed. He had reached. But he had never commanded Ranger to find him. Never given the animal the one familiar shape of obedience that might have cut through the panic. It was irrational. He knew that. The bridge had collapsed. The flood had been chaos. A command would not have changed water, wood, or fate. But guilt was not a court of law, and it did not care about evidence. It only cared that Ethan was still alive to accuse. "I'm sorry," he said. The creek answered by slamming a branch into his hip. He nearly lost his grip. For a moment, rage saved him. Pure, hot, ugly rage. He clung tighter, teeth bared, furious at the water, at the night, at the years, at the way loss kept asking interest on debts no man could pay. If he died here, the creek would take that too. It would take the apology before anyone heard it. It would take the name before he finished saying it. "No," Ethan growled. He shifted again, not upward this time, but sideways, trying to wedge his left shoulder deeper between two roots. The movement cost him. Pain ripped through his leg and climbed into his stomach. He almost vomited into the current, but the new position gave him a fraction more support. His chest rested against the muddy shelf. His arms still held the branch, but not all his weight hung from them now. Better. Not safe. Better. The storm slowly began to change. It did not end. It thinned. Rain softened from hard needles to cold threads. The wind dropped from a roar to a long, tired moan through the pines. The creek remained furious, swollen with everything that had fallen upstream. But the sky above the treetops began to loosen from black into a bruised gray. Dawn was coming. Ethan had never loved dawn in any sentimental way. In the teams, dawn often meant movement, exposure, heat, decisions. At the cabin, dawn meant work. But now, seeing the faintest pale line beyond the pines, he felt an absurd tenderness for it, and the world, rude and relentless, was still turning its face toward light. He tried to shout, "Hank!" His voice came out as a torn rasp. He swallowed rainwater and tried again. "Hank!" The forest took the sound and did nothing useful with it. Hank's place was too far. A mile through trees, maybe more by the old trail. No one would hear him. No one would come looking before morning errands. And morning errands did not begin in storms unless trouble knocked loudly. Ethan looked toward the cabin. The generator's growl had faded under the creek, or perhaps his ears had stopped sorting sounds properly. A dim light still glowed in one window. It looked warm, almost insulting. His own house watched him drown with a lamp on. He thought of the collar by the front door. For years he had left it hanging there like punishment. Maybe that had been easier than admitting the truth. He had been afraid that if he took it down, he would have to decide whether Ranger was gone or waiting. A hanging collar could be both. A wound and a prayer disguised as leather. His fingers slipped. Not far. Just enough. He jerked them tight again, but panic fluttered through him. His hands were going. Cold had reached the small muscles. His right arm trembled uncontrollably. The branch felt thinner now, slicker, less like rescue, and more like a thing he was asking too much of. He lowered his forehead to the bark. "Ranger," he whispered. Not a shout this time. Not a command. Just a name. The sky brightened by one shade. Ethan's breathing turned shallow, and he knew he should keep fighting. He knew all the old lessons. Move, think, hold, endure. Pain is data. Panic is noise. Survive the minute, then survive the next. But there are moments when even disciplined men become simply human. His arms shook. His broken leg pulsed. His chest hurt. He was so tired. A strange calm approached, quiet as snow. It did not feel like death exactly. It felt like permission. His mind offered him the soft, treacherous thought that letting go would end the pain. No more cold, no more debt, no more waking to a world in which the best thing he had ever loved had vanished because it followed him into danger. His left hand slipped again. This time, 2 fingers lost the branch. Ethan closed his eyes. And then, from somewhere above the creek, through rain, water, wind, and the gray edge of morning, a bark tore across the bank. Short, hoarse, urgent. Ethan's eyes opened. For a second, he thought the cold had finally reached his mind. The bark came again, rougher than memory, aged by distance and weather, but carrying a shape his heart knew before reason could stand up. His breath caught. Slowly, painfully, Ethan lifted his head toward the bank. He could not see clearly through rain and dawn blur, but he heard it again. A bark he had carried in silence for years. And this time the sound did not come from memory. Ethan Cole had heard many sounds in his life that did not belong to mercy. The crack of rifles over dry stone, the tearing breath of wounded men, the low, final groan of timber before it gave way beneath floodwater. But the bark that came from the bank above Briar Creek was different. It cut through rain and current not like a warning, but like a hand reaching down through the dark. He lifted his head. At first he saw only a shape. The morning was still half made, gray and cold, with rain hanging in the air like torn thread. The bank above him blurred in and out through water in his eyes. His body had grown so cold that the world no longer seemed fully trustworthy. Pain had sharpened some things and erased others. The trees leaned, the creek roared, and the muddy bank shifted in the pale light. Then the shape moved. A German shepherd stood at the edge of the bank. The dog's coat was black and gold, though soaked so thoroughly that the colors ran dark under the rain. The body was leaner than Ethan remembered, the ribs not showing exactly, but close enough to tell a long story of hunger, miles, and winters survived without kindness arriving on schedule. One ear stood high, the other bore a small torn notch near the edge. Old scars marked the shoulder and one foreleg, pale lines under wet fur, like roads drawn by suffering and never erased. But it was the eyes that reached Ethan first. Amber brown, steady, focused, not soft, not wild, not confused. And those eyes held this terrible patience of a trained dog reading danger and deciding what must be done. Ethan tried to speak, but his mouth barely formed the word. "Ranger?" The dog barked once, short, hoarse, urgent. Ethan's fingers tightened around the branch, as if the sound itself it might pull him under. For a moment, his mind refused the truth. It was too large, too cruel if false, too beautiful if real. Men could see strange things when cold and pain had worked on them long enough. He knew that. A dying brain could light old memories and hold them up like lanterns. But the dog lowered his head. The dog looked at the current, then at Ethan, then back at the current. That was not a ghost. Ghosts did not calculate. Ranger moved along the bank, searching for a way down, and he did not leap blindly into the strongest water. Even now, after years and weather and whatever wilderness had done to him, the old training lived somewhere under the scars. He tested the mud with one paw, withdrew, moved farther downstream where a root shelf broke the force of the current, then entered the creek at an angle. "No," Ethan rasped. It came out weak, nearly useless. Ranger went anyway. The water hit the dog hard. For one frightening second, it pushed him sideways and nearly rolled him under. Ranger's head vanished behind a rush of brown water, then broke the surface again. His ears flattened, his mouth opened as he fought for breath. He did not try to swim straight against the creek, and he cut across it, using the push of the water instead of pretending strength alone could defeat it. Ethan watched, helpless and horrified. This was the nightmare reversed. Years ago, water had torn Ranger away while Ethan reached and failed. Now the dog was coming back through water, and Ethan had no strength left to stop him. "Don't," Ethan whispered. But Ranger had never been good at abandoning him. The dog reached the tangle of roots near Ethan's shoulder and clawed for purchase. His front paws struck mud, slipped, struck again. He snarled, not at Ethan, not from anger, but from effort. A sound pulled from the bottom of his chest. Then he lunged forward and clamped his teeth into the back collar of Ethan's rain jacket. The grip was exact. Not flesh, not throat. Fabric, the old rescue bite. A sob broke in Ethan's chest, too small to hear under the creek. Ranger pulled. Pain exploded through Ethan's broken leg as his body shifted. The current seized the movement and tried to turn him sideways. Ethan gasped, nearly losing the branch. Ranger dug his paws into the submerged roots and pulled again, not dragging Ethan far, only changing the angle of him inch by brutal inch. Ethan understood. Ranger was not trying to haul him all the way out. The dog was trying to move him away from the worst of the current, toward the shallow pocket behind the root shelf. Ethan forced his left boot against the mud beneath him. His body screamed, His hands barely obeyed, but Ranger's pull gave him direction. And direction was sometimes enough to keep a man alive. "Oh, again," Ethan breathed. Ranger pulled. Ethan pushed. Water slammed into Ethan's ribs. Mud broke under his elbow. The branch bent above him, then sprang back as some of his weight shifted toward the shelf. Ranger lost footing, slid back half a foot, then recovered with a violent shake of his head, teeth still locked in the jacket. The sound Ethan made then was half pain, half prayer. The dog's paws scraped stone. His claws tore at mud. His whole body trembled with the effort, soaked fur flat against muscle and bone. He was no young animal bursting with easy power. He was a survivor, scarred and weathered, spending whatever strength remained because loyalty had never learned how to count the cost. And then Ethan whispered one word from another lifetime: "Hold." And Ranger froze exactly as he had been trained to do, teeth locked in the jacket, body braced against the water, proving in that single impossible second that the years had taken many things from them, but not the language between a man and his dog. Ethan closed his eyes, not to rest, to keep from breaking. "Good boy," he said. The words were torn, thin, barely human. Ranger gave a low, strained sound without releasing the jacket. Ethan used the moment. With his left hand, he grabbed a higher root. With the right, he shoved against the branch. Ranger pulled in the same instant, and Ethan's upper body slid forward onto the muddy shelf. His broken leg caught in the current. He nearly blacked out. His broken leg caught in the current. He nearly blacked out. The pain came up from the bone like white fire. His vision narrowed. He felt his grip fail, then Ranger's teeth jerked hard at his jacket, dragging his shoulder higher, keeping him from slipping backward. Ethan cursed through clenched teeth and shoved once more. His hips cleared the strongest water. The creek still gripped his lower legs, still hammered at him, but the killing force had lessened. He was no longer hanging in the main current. He lay half on mud, half among roots, chest heaving, face pressed against wet earth. Ranger released the jacket and stumbled beside him. For a moment, the dog simply stood there, legs shaking, head lowered, water streamed from his muzzle. His chest worked hard, each breath rough and deep, and he looked older now than he had from the bank. Not broken, never that. But worn by miles, Ethan had not walked with him. By winters, Ethan had not seen. By hunger, Ethan had not known. Ethan turned his head. The movement was small, but it cost him. Ranger stepped closer. The dog pressed his wet nose against Ethan's cheek. That was when Ethan knew. Not because of the bark, not because of the eyes, not even because of the old command. Ranger had always done that after a rescue drill, nose to cheek, a check, a question. "Are you still with me?" Ethan gave something like a laugh, though it sounded more like grief learning to breathe. "You came back," he whispered. Ranger nudged him again, harder this time, as if sentiment was a luxury and the situation remained poorly managed. And it was almost funny. Almost. Ethan tried to lift one hand toward him, but his arm shook so badly that it dropped into the mud. Ranger lowered his head into the failed touch anyway, pressing his skull under Ethan's palm until Ethan's fingers rested against wet fur. The fur was real. The heat beneath it was real. The scar along the ear was real. Ethan's breath hitched. For years he had imagined apologies. He had spoken some into empty rooms. He had buried others behind his teeth. But now that the dog was here, alive and shaking beside him in the rain, all language became too small. "I thought I lost you," he said. Ranger looked toward the cabin, then toward the trees. His ears shifted. Ethan followed the movement with heavy eyes. The cabin was visible through the rain, lights faint in the windows, close enough to mock him, and far enough to be impossible. The slope between here and there was mud, roots, and pain. Ethan could not crawl it. Not with the leg. Not with the cold already inside him. Ranger seemed to understand before Ethan fully did. The dog stepped around him, sniffed his sleeve, then the broken line of his body, then the bank above. He gave one sharp bark toward Ethan's face. "No," Ethan said, though he did not know what he was refusing. Ranger turned. Ethan's heart lurched. "No, stay." The word came out sharper than he intended. Old fear rose in him, fast and ugly. He had watched Ranger vanish once. At the idea of seeing him turn away now, even for a reason, tore through Ethan worse than the broken bone. Ranger stopped. For a heartbeat, the dog looked back. There was no confusion in that face. Only decision. Only the grave intelligence of a creature who understood that lying beside Ethan would feel faithful, but finding help would keep him alive. Ethan saw it then. The mission was not finished. His throat tightened. "Ranger," he whispered. The dog waited. Ethan swallowed against cold pain and the childish part of him that wanted to keep the miracle where he could see it. Then he forced the old command through his teeth. "Go." Ranger's ears lifted. "Find help." The words were weaker than they had ever been on any training field, but Ranger heard them. His body changed at once, but not younger, not stronger, but directed. Purpose moved through him like flame finding dry wood. He stepped close one last time and pressed his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder. Then Ranger turned and climbed the bank. He slipped once in the mud, recovered, and looked back from the top. Ethan lay below, half on the root shelf, half in the cold shallows, breathing in broken pulls. Ranger barked again. Not farewell, not panic, something closer to a promise. And then he vanished into the wet pines. Ethan watched the place where he had disappeared. The rain kept falling. The creek kept roaring. But for the first time since the water took him, Ethan did not feel alone, and he lowered his cheek against the mud, one hand still gripping a root, and held on to the sound of Ranger's bark long after the forest swallowed it. Ranger reached Hank Mercer's porch like a creature pulled forward by more than muscle. The old dog came out of the trees at a staggered run, black and gold coat soaked flat against his ribs, paws striking mud, breath tearing from his chest in rough bursts. Rain had softened to a cold drizzle, but the world still looked wounded by the storm. Branches lay across the path. Water dripped from the eaves. The yard in front of Hank's house had turned into a skin of brown mud over frozen ground. Inside, Hank had been awake since before dawn. At 66, Hank Mercer no longer slept deeply during hard weather. Years of logging, rescue calls, and bad news arriving before sunrise had trained his bones to listen when the mountain shifted its weight. And he was a broad, weathered man with a trimmed gray beard, short gray hair flattened by years of caps, and hands thick enough to make coffee mugs look delicate. His face carried deep lines at the eyes and mouth, not from bitterness, but from squinting into storms and telling frightened people they were going to be all right, even when he was not sure. He stood at his kitchen counter, pouring black coffee into a dented thermos, when the barking began. Not distant, not casual, right outside his door. Hank froze. The bark came again, hoarse and urgent. He crossed the room fast for a man his age, grabbing the old flashlight beside the door. When he opened it, Ranger stood on the porch boards, trembling so hard water scattered from his coat, and the German shepherd's head was low, ears sharp despite the torn notch in one, amber-brown eyes burning with the desperate focus Hank had seen before in working dogs. "Well now," Hank said quietly. For weeks, he had seen this dog at the edge of his property. A shadow at dawn, paw prints by the feed shed, food missing from the bowl Hank left near the porch steps. The dog never let him close, never begged, never wagged like a stray looking for a family. He came and went like a soldier crossing enemy ground. But now he had come to the door. Hank stepped out slowly. "You hurt, boy?" Ranger backed away before Hank could touch him. Then the dog lunged forward, caught the sleeve of Hank's flannel shirt gently between his teeth, and tugged. Not a bite. A message. Hank's expression changed. He had been a volunteer rescue man long enough to recognize the difference between panic and direction. Panic circled. Direction pulled. Ranger released the sleeve, bounded down the porch steps, then stopped in the yard and looked back toward Ethan's place. Hank's stomach tightened. "Ethan?" Ranger barked once. The sound was harsh, almost broken, but it landed with the force of an answer. Hank turned back into the house. Age slowed a man, but purpose could still put fire in old joints. He grabbed his heavy brown canvas coat, the one patched at both elbows, pulled a gray knit cap over his head, and slung a coil of rescue rope over one shoulder. From the wall near the pantry, he took a compact first aid kit and a handheld radio. The radio crackled when he keyed it. "Chaw, County Rescue, this is Mercer, Northridge Private Road. Possible water rescue near Cole property. Repeat, possible water rescue near Briar Creek. Need a crew and medical." Static answered first. Then a woman's voice cut through. "Mercer, this is Mara Pike. Say again, water rescue?" Mara Pike was the closest emergency medic on call that morning. 32 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with dark blonde hair usually braided tight under a rescue helmet, and the brisk calm of someone who had learned to make fear stand in line. She was not sentimental in emergencies. Hank liked that about her. Sentiment could come after the bleeding stopped. "Ethan Cole may be down near the creek," Hank said. "Dog came to get me." There was a half-second pause. Then Mara said, "We're rolling. Chun, do not enter the water alone." Hank looked at Ranger, already pacing at the edge of the yard. "Wouldn't dream of doing anything foolish," Hank said, and clipped the radio to his coat. Mara knew him too well to answer that. Ranger led before Hank had both boots properly laced. The path between Hank's place and Ethan's cabin was not truly a path anymore. The storm had changed it into a slick, brown vein through the trees. Fallen needles hid roots. Water ran in narrow streams where dry ground had been the day before. Ranger moved ahead with intense purpose, but not blindly. Every 20 or 30 yards, he turned back to check Hank's progress. Hank noticed that. It was not the behavior of a feral dog. It was trained, and the old man pushed through wet brush, breath steaming, knees complaining, one hand on his walking stick and the other on the rope coil. "All right, boy," he muttered. "I'm coming." Ranger slipped under a fallen branch, then doubled back when Hank had to climb over it. Once the dog vanished into low fog near the creek trail, and Hank felt a cold fear that he had lost him. Then Ranger's bark came from ahead, not panicked, but commanding. "Move." Hank obeyed. Halfway to Ethan's cabin, Ranger stopped beside a patch of washed-out mud and lowered his nose to the ground, not to track forward, but to touch one deep boot print filling with rainwater, as if the dog had found the exact place where Ethan's last safe step had ended. Hank stared at the print. One boot. Deep heel, dragged edge, and then a smear toward the creek. The old rescue man in him woke fully. "Damn," he breathed. Ranger was already moving again. They came through the trees behind Ethan's cabin just as the first pale gold of morning pressed against the storm clouds. The generator still ran near the shed, its engine coughing in uneven rhythm. The drainage channel was free now, water rushing through it hard and clean, but the bank below it had collapsed in a fresh wound of mud and torn roots. Hank followed the sound of Ranger's bark down to the creek. Then he saw Ethan. At first he looked like part of the bank. Olive shirt dark with water, one arm hooked through roots, face gray, body twisted half out of the current. His lower legs were still close enough to the water that every surge licked at him, and his right leg lay at a wrong angle. Hank's mouth went dry. "Ethan!" Ethan's head moved a fraction. That was all. Ranger scrambled down the muddy slope and pressed his nose against Ethan's cheek. Ethan's lips moved, but Hank could not hear the words over the creek. "Hold on, son," Hank called. "You hear me? Hold on." He tied one end of the rope around a thick pine above the bank, testing it twice. Then he eased himself down toward Ethan, boots sliding, knees sinking in mud. He did not go into the main water. Mara's warning had been right, and Hank was old, not stupid. Mostly. He reached Ethan's shoulder and felt for a pulse at the neck. There. Weak, but there. Ethan's skin was cold enough to frighten him. "Leg's broken," Hank said, though Ethan probably knew that better than anyone. "You're half frozen, too. Always did like doing things thoroughly." Ethan's eyes opened slightly. "Dog," he rasped. Hank glanced at Ranger, who stood shivering inches away, refusing to retreat. "He got me," Hank said. "That dog got me." Something changed in Ethan's face. Not relief exactly. Something deeper and more painful, like a man hearing a prayer answered in a language he thought he had forgotten. Hank secured a loop around Ethan's chest and under one arm, careful not to shift the broken leg more than necessary. Ranger watched every movement with fierce suspicion. Once, when Hank pulled too fast, the dog gave a low warning sound. Hank paused. "I know, boy, I know. I'm trying not to ruin him." Ranger stared at him another second, then returned his nose to Ethan's shoulder, and the rescue crew arrived 12 minutes later. Mara Pike came first down the slope, carrying a medical pack and wearing a red waterproof jacket that made her look like the only warm thing in the forest. Behind her came Deputy Owen Rusk, a tall, narrow man in his early 40s, with a shaved head, a rain-dark uniform, and the careful movements of someone used to bad ground and worse mornings. Owen had a reserved face but kind hands. He carried a backboard and another rope without wasting breath on unnecessary questions. Mara knelt beside Ethan and checked his pupils, pulse, breathing, and temperature. "Ethan, can you hear me?" she asked. His eyes opened. "Creek's loud," he murmured. Hank barked a short laugh despite himself, still complaining. "Oh, good sign." Mara looked at the broken leg and exhaled through her nose. "We stabilize here, then move him up. Hypothermia risk is serious." Ranger stood between Mara and Ethan for half a second, uncertain. Mara noticed immediately. She lowered her voice. "Easy, buddy. I'm helping him." Ranger's ears twitched. Ethan moved 2 fingers weakly against the mud. "Ranger!" The dog stepped back just enough. Mara looked at Hank. Hank looked at the dog. Neither said what both were thinking. They worked quickly. Splint, thermal blanket, rope assist, backboard, slow lift up the bank. Ethan groaned only once when the broken leg shifted, and even then the sound seemed to anger him more than the pain itself. Ranger followed every inch. Even then, the sound seemed to anger him more than the pain itself. Ranger followed every inch. When the rescuers loaded Ethan into the back of the ambulance, Ranger tried to climb in after him. Owen reached out to stop him, but Hank caught his wrist. "Let him." Owen hesitated. "Regulations. Hell with regulations," Hank said. "That dog brought us here." Mara, already securing Ethan's IV line, looked at Ranger and then at Ethan's pale face. "Let him ride," she said. So Ranger climbed in. He lay on the floor beside the stretcher, wet, exhausted, and shaking. But when Ethan's hand slipped over the edge, Ranger pressed his head beneath it. Ethan did not wake fully during the ride, and at the small clinic in town, they warmed him slowly, treated the shock, set the broken leg temporarily, and prepared him for transfer if needed. Hours passed in fragments. White ceiling, murmured voices, the tight smell of antiseptic, pain blooming and receding under medication. When Ethan finally opened his eyes with true awareness, late morning had settled beyond the clinic windows. Hank sat in a chair near the wall, coat still damp, hat in his hands. He looked older now that the emergency had passed. Ethan swallowed. His voice came out rough. "Where's the dog?" Hank leaned forward. At the foot of the bed, Ranger lay on a folded blanket someone had finally convinced him to use. His coat had been towel-dried badly, but lovingly. One ear twitched when Ethan spoke, and without standing, the old German shepherd lifted his head and looked at him. Ethan stared. Ranger's tail moved once. Not a wag exactly, more like a tired salute. Hank cleared his throat. "He's been around for months." Ethan did not look away from Ranger. "I saw him near my place," Hank continued. "Couldn't get close. Left food out. He'd eat after I went in. I thought he was just some old stray with too much pride." Ethan's eyes shone, though no tear fell. Hank's voice softened. Maybe he wasn't coming back all at once. Maybe he was circling the only home he still remembered, waiting for one of you to be brave enough to believe it. Ranger lowered his head again, but his eyes stayed open. Ethan's hand moved slowly over the blanket. Ranger dragged himself closer by inches until his muzzle reached Ethan's fingers. This time, Ethan touched him. No dream dissolved. No ghost vanished. The dog was warm beneath his hand, and for the first time in years, Ethan let himself believe that the river had not taken everything. Ethan Cole returned to the cabin with one leg braced, one hand on a crutch, and the old strange feeling that the world had gone on without asking his permission. The clinic had kept him 2 days longer than he wanted. Mara Pike had called him a difficult patient, with the flat affection of a medic who had seen grown men argue with thermometers, and Hank Mercer had threatened to nail his boots to the floor if he tried walking home before the doctor signed the discharge papers. Ethan did not argue much, not because he had become agreeable, because Ranger lay beneath the clinic bed the entire time, and every time Ethan shifted too quickly, the German shepherd lifted his head with that amber-eyed judgment that made disobedience feel childish. And by the time Hank drove them back through the wet mountain roads, the storm had passed. Sunlight touched the tops of the pines. The creek still ran high beside the cabin, brown and restless, but no longer furious. Its voice had changed from a roar to a warning mutter, the way an old god might grumble after losing an argument. Ranger sat in the back seat of Hank's truck on an old blanket. The black and gold coat had dried into rough waves. In daylight, the years showed more clearly. He was no longer the flawless 5-year-old working dog Ethan had lost to the flood. He was older now, around 8 or 9, leaner, scarred across one shoulder, with a torn notch in one ear and a slight stiffness in his left front leg. Yet the dignity remained. He looked out the window, not like a stray being brought somewhere new, but like a soldier returning to ground he had never surrendered in his heart. Hank glanced at Ethan. "You all right?" Ethan looked down at the brace around his leg. "That depends how honest you want me to be." "Lie a little. I'm old." Ethan almost smiled. That small, almost smile was enough to make Hank shut up for a rare and merciful minute. Inside the cabin, everything smelled of damp wood, generator smoke, and survival. The sump pump had done its job. The basement was wet at the edges, but not ruined. The stove waited cold. Ranger stepped in first, slow and careful, nose working through the air. Then he stopped, his eyes fixed on the peg near the front door. Ranger's old brown leather collar still hung there. For years it had been a relic, a punishment, a silent witness to Ethan's failure. Now, with Ranger standing beneath it, alive and breathing, the collar looked almost embarrassed to have been mourned so long. Ethan reached for it. His fingers trembled. Hank, wise enough at last, looked away and busied himself with the stove. Ethan lowered himself onto the bench by the door. Ranger came to him without being called. The dog stood still while Ethan unfastened the cracked buckle, smoothed the worn leather once with his thumb, and placed it around Ranger's neck. The collar fit a little tighter than before, or maybe memory had made the past smaller. Ethan fastened the buckle and rested his hand there, against leather and warm fur. "I kept it," he whispered. Ranger leaned his head into Ethan's knee. That was all. No grand music, no shining revelation. Just an old dog, an injured man, and a cabin that finally remembered how to be a home. A week later, when Ethan could move from chair to porch without Hank glaring at him like an unpaid debt collector, they began tracing Ranger's missing years. It started with a call from Deputy Owen Rusk. Owen, tall and narrow with his shaved head and careful voice, had checked old reports downstream from the flood. Most led nowhere. Washed-out roads, missing livestock, a broken dock, a fisherman who swore he saw a black dog fighting the current, 2 counties south, but had never filed anything official. Then Owen found a name. Walt Granger. Walt had been a man who lived near an abandoned fishing camp downriver, far beyond the usual search grid from the old flood. He had died the previous winter. No close family nearby. No internet. No social media. No habit of calling authorities unless a tree was across the road or someone was bleeding on his porch. Hank knew the type. "Mountain hermit," he said. "Usually either mean as a hornet or gentle as bread dough. No middle ground." Ethan did not laugh this time. 2 days later, Hank drove Ethan and Ranger to Walt's old place. The cabin sat beyond a washed-out logging road, half hidden by cedar and alder, with a sagging porch and a rusted rain barrel under one corner. It was smaller than Ethan's, rougher, the kind of place built by a man who trusted walls only as much as necessary. The windows were dusty. The yard had gone wild. But beside the steps sat an old metal bowl, dented and weather-stained. Ranger walked to it and lowered his nose. Ethan felt the air leave him. Walt Granger was not there to introduce himself, so the house did it for him. He had been a thin old man in the few photographs left on the mantel, with silver hair cropped short, a narrow face burned brown by weather, and pale eyes that looked directly into the camera as if daring it to lie. In one photo, he wore an olive-brown work jacket, a gray thermal shirt, canvas trousers, rubber boots, and a faded cap, and he looked hard at first glance. But the house told a softer truth. Neatly stacked firewood, clean bowls, repaired blankets, a shelf of canned dog food bought in bulk, and a hand-built ramp beside the back steps for an animal that must once have struggled to climb. "He found him," Hank said quietly. Ethan did not answer. In the corner near the stove, they found an old folded blanket still holding black and gold hairs. Ranger stepped onto it, turned once, and lay down. Not asleep. Remembering. Ethan lowered himself into a chair. Hank searched a small desk and found a notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting inside was spare, uneven, practical. Walt had recorded weather, creek levels, repairs, hunting tracks, and once in a while the dog. Found shepherd near South Bend after flood. Hurt bad. No collar. Won't let me touch left side. Smart eyes. Knows commands. Ethan closed his eyes. Hank turned a page. Dog limps less today. Eats like he forgives me. Another page. Called him soldier. Doesn't answer much. Looks north when thunder starts. Ethan opened his eyes. Hank looked at him but said nothing. Then, near the back of the notebook, Ethan found one line written in darker pencil, pressed so hard it had cut the paper. Every storm, soldier walks to the north fence and waits like somebody out there still owns his heart. The room seemed to still. Even the wind outside went quiet for a breath. Ethan looked at Ranger lying on the blanket. The dog's eyes were open. North, Ethan thought. All those years. Not lost completely. Not gone. Not dead beneath the water. And just held at the edge of another man's kindness, looking north whenever the sky began to break. Ethan had spent years believing Ranger had vanished into the flood because he had failed him. But Ranger had been alive, wounded, waiting, searching in the only way a dog could search, when roads, names, and human systems meant nothing. Walt's notebook explained the rest in fragments. Ranger had nearly died from infection. Walt had cleaned the wounds, fed him broth, slept beside him through fever. The dog had no readable tag, no collar, and if he had ever carried a chip, Walt had no scanner and no reason to know where to look. When Ranger recovered, he stayed for a time, not tame exactly, but companionable. Then Walt grew ill. After Walt died, neighbors left food now and then, but Ranger drifted north, toward Ethan, toward the creek, toward home. On the drive back, Ethan held the notebook in his lap. Ranger slept across the rear seat, finally exhausted in a way that looked almost peaceful. Hank drove without speaking for several miles. At last he said, "You know what this means?" Ethan looked at him. "It means grief lied to you," Hank said. "Did a convincing job, too, but it lied." Ethan turned his face toward the window. Outside, the mountains rolled past in blue-gray silence. When they reached the cabin, Ethan did not hang the old collar back on the peg. It stayed where it belonged, around Ranger's neck. Days settled slowly after that. Ethan healed in uneven stages. He cursed at the crutches, Ed slowly after that. Ethan healed in uneven stages. He cursed at the crutches. He hated asking Hank to bring firewood. He disliked Mara's follow-up visits because she had the nerve to be right about rest. Ranger, however, approved of all medical tyranny. If Ethan tried to stand too quickly, Ranger rose and blocked him with his body, old ears forward, eyes stern. "You too?" Ethan muttered. Ranger sneezed once. Hank, dropping firewood by the porch, laughed. That dog's got more sense than both of us. For the first time in years, Ethan laughed back. Not much, but enough. By late afternoon, the cabin often filled with a quiet that no longer felt empty. Ranger slept beside the stove, paws twitching sometimes in dreams. Ethan would sit in the old chair, Walt's notebook on the table, and let himself imagine the years he had missed. Not as punishment, but as proof. Ranger had suffered. Ranger had survived. Ranger had been cared for by a lonely man named Walt, who had unknowingly kept Ethan's last loyal friend alive. There was sorrow in that. But not only sorrow. One evening, when the sky cleared after a small rain, Ethan hobbled onto the porch with Ranger beside him. The creek below ran bright under the sinking sun, touching stone after stone, never holding its shape and somehow remaining itself. Hank arrived with an armload of split wood and a paper bag of biscuits from town. "Mrs. Klein says you're too skinny," Hank announced. "Oh, she says that to everyone." "She said it to the dog, too." Ranger looked mildly offended. Hank set the wood down and nodded toward him. "I'm telling you, Ethan, that old boy is running this cabin better than you ever did. Might be the first competent authority this property's had." Ethan looked down at Ranger, then back to the creek. The corner of his mouth lifted. For a man like Ethan Cole, it was not a small thing. It was sunrise breaking through a locked room. Hank left before dark. Ethan remained on the porch. Ranger lay beside his old work boots, head resting against the boards, the brown leather collar visible beneath thick fur. The creek kept moving, carrying rainwater, leaves, broken twigs, and the memory of every storm that had tried to own it. Once Ethan had heard that sound as accusation. Now he heard something else. Return. He placed his hand on Ranger's head. The dog breathed out slowly, deeply, with the tired trust of a creature that had finally completed a long journey. The flood had taken the bridge. It had taken years. It had taken peace and hidden it under guilt. But it had not taken loyalty. It had not taken love. And it had not taken the road home from a heart that remembered. Final message. Some stories remind us that love does not always return in the way we expect. Ethan believed the flood had taken Ranger forever. For years, he carried guilt like a stone in his chest, believing that the one friend who had stood beside him through darkness was gone because of him. But life has a way of revealing truths slowly. Sometimes what we call an ending is only a road we cannot yet see. Ranger's return was not just the return of a lost dog. It was a reminder that loyalty can survive distance, pain, silence, and time. It was a reminder that even when we think God has allowed something precious to be taken from us, He may still be working in ways hidden from our eyes. Maybe the miracle was not only that Ranger came back. Maybe the miracle was that he survived long enough to find Ethan when Ethan needed him most. In our daily lives, many of us carry our own floods. We carry regret, grief, loneliness, and questions that were never answered. We wonder why something happened, why someone left, why a prayer seemed to go unheard. But this story reminds us to keep holding on. The answer may not come today. The road may be long. But grace often travels quietly, through unexpected people, faithful animals, kind neighbors, and small signs that tell us we are not forgotten. Sometimes God sends help with hands. Sometimes He sends it with paws. And sometimes He sends it through a love we thought we had lost forever. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us about a loyal animal, a miracle, or a moment in your life when help came just when you needed it most. And if you want more stories about courage, loyalty, faith, and the bond between people and animals, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your home, comfort your heart, and remind you every day that true love, once given, is never truly lost.